I want to read for you a passage of Scripture, and it may be taken the wrong way because of the metaphor. I'm going to talk to you about a builder of walls, but I'm not talking about the walls that you all will be thinking about. So please shift gears. I'm talking about a civil engineer by the name of Nehemiah, whose city lay in ruins because of his love for his beloved city, Jerusalem, which was destroyed and lying in ruins. And he is now in a palatial setting. And his brother comes to visit with him, and I want to read the conversation. And that is this chapter 1 of the book of Nehemiah. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men. And I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, and he goes on to pray a remarkable prayer. You begin in chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, that's 4 months later, 4 months after this conversation with his brother, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should not my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild it. Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take? And when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, and so I set a time. When you look at all the building of walls that we talk about in our time, very few leaders actually talk about the moral walls that have been broken down, the boundaries that God had set for our existence. We think of every other kind of structure and edifice, and yet the internal rot that has set in and the redefinition of so many things in our cultural existence. The America of today, if you were to compare it to some decades ago, is a dramatically different culture. And in many, many ways, it is reflecting many other parts of the world. It was Malcolm Muggeridge, who was probably one of the leading commentators of the cultural rot in the 1970s, who said this. I had the privilege of being with Muggeridge 7 months before he died. It was a dream for me to be with him. I think the most articulate and poignant English journalist of the 20th century. It is a toss-up between him and G.K. Chesterton. Muggeridge's books are so remarkable. If you haven't read some of his writings, here was a man who knew how to turn a phrase. And he once said, if he ever stood before God and God would give him a moment or two to ask for forgiveness, one of the things he would ask for forgiveness for was for being so fatally fluent. He was editor of Punch magazine and a great writer. And Muggeridge said a couple of things that were so, I think, prophetic that I want to read at least one of them for you and begin my message by pointing out how fascinating it is what he said 40 or 50 years ago. First, he said this: it is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, and vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct. Writing in the 70s, created, boredom out of our own affluence, impotence out of our own erotomania, vulnerability out of our own strength. We blow the trumpet that brings the walls of our own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility and drugged himself into stupefaction. You see, there's nothing so vulgar left in the human experience for which you cannot bring in some Ivy League professor from somewhere to justify it. And writing in the 40s, it was Aldous Huxley, the humanist, who reminded us we are living today not in the delicious intoxication of the early successes of science, rather in the grisly morning after, where it has become quite apparent that what science may have actually done is to introduce us to improved means in order to obtain hitherto unimproved or rather deteriorated ends. What science may have done is to introduce us to improved means in order to obtain hitherto unimproved or rather deteriorated ends. So when a humanist points it out like that, and when a cultural critic like Muggeridge points it out, and then we read these words from Muggeridge, which I think are so powerful, because writing in that latter part of the 20th century, he was at that time chaplain of Edinburgh University, and at the famed St. Giles in Scotland, when he offered in his resignation and left the university scene, he left it because of decisions that were being made in higher education that he thought were going to be destructive and decimating, ultimately, of young minds. One of the things they had made decisions at that point was to hand out contraception to university students and so on, as a gesture that this is the kind of lifestyle we'll lead anyway, so we may as well support you in this fashion. And in his last message, out of the famed pulpit where Knox too had thundered forth, he said this: "So dear Edinburgh students, this may well be the last time I address you, and this is what I want to say to you, and I don't really care whether it means anything to you or not, and whether you think there is anything in it or not. I want you to believe that this row I have had with your elected officers has nothing to do with any puritanical attitudes on my part. I have no belief in abstinence for abstinence's own sake, no wish under any circumstances to check any fulfillment of your life and being. But I have to say to you this, that whatever life is or is not about, it is not to be expressed in terms of drug stupefaction and casual sexual relations. However else we may venture into the unknown, it is not, I assure you, on the plastic wings of Playboy magazine or psychedelic fancies. However we will venture forth into the future, it is not going to be on the plastic wings of Playboy magazine or psychedelic fancies." Fascinating that he, as a journalist, was talking in those terms. And the famed theologian Carl F. Henry, I had the privilege of studying under him in my days at Trinity. He made this comment in one of his books: "Biblical truth, transcultural as it is, has an indispensable message for contemporary culture. It addresses modern learning, modern ethics, modern political economic concerns, and all the idolatries of our polytheistic society. It proclaims the gospel to a generation that is intellectually uncapped, morally unzippered, and volitionally uncurbed. Those who consider the latest fads permanently in will, of course, dismiss the Christian message as the last hurrah of an antiquated outlook. They reveal their sickness of soul by derogating terms like morality, piety, family, work, patriotism, born again, and evangelical theology. Christianity they dismiss as a kind of middle-class hedonism, declaring it to be intellectually inadmissible. They meanwhile espouse a life that neither reason nor conscience or spirit can support or condone. Repression of sensuality and of self-gratification they call psychotically abnormal. Subordination of the flesh they leave to medieval monks or consigned to the future resurrection. Affirming sexual pleasure to be the supreme good of a life of unending revelry, they waste away into ethical ghosts and skeletons. How much more graphic can intellectual, solid thinkers get than that? Intellectually uncapped and morally unzippered. We are wasting away into ethical ghosts and skeletons. The body, which is intended to be the temple of God, has now become the object of idolatry in the perverse sense of the term, and we measure everything in life by the gratification that this can bring to us, and lost our way on the sacredness for which this was intended. Into this arena, into this kind of a situation, you and I are called as missionaries to take the message wherever it is that God has placed you and is calling you to minister.